They said, nursing home or the street, choose now. So I chose the street. I didn't shout it, didn't argue or plead. I just stood there in my own living room, the same one where I'd hosted every Thanksgiving for 40 years, and listened to my children give me two options that both sounded like exile. They said it as if they were discussing a houseplant that had grown too large for the corner. Their faces were rehearsed, patient, composed. My daughter, Elaine, crossed her arms and said, "Mom, you're being unreasonable. We can't keep worrying every time you forget to lock the door." My son, Peter, avoided my eyes entirely, pretending to check something on his phone, as if compassion were too bright a light to look directly at. There was a silence after that, the kind that has weight to it, the kind you can feel pressing against your chest. I remember thinking that I would have preferred shouting. At least shouting is human, alive. What they gave me instead was management. "We've already visited a place," Elaine said. "It's really lovely, clean, safe, lots of activities." Safe. Activities. Words they used like consolation prizes. I nodded slowly, because that's what I'd learned to do when they believed they were helping. But inside me, something began to tighten, like a fist forming in the dark. They thought I didn't notice how they'd already made the arrangements. The brochures were neatly stacked on the coffee table, the ink still smelling new. "Silver Pines Assisted Living," it said in cheerful lettering, beside a photo of a white-haired woman playing cards with other smiling white-haired women, all of them frozen in the same identical grin. I looked at the picture and wondered if they knew they'd photographed surrender. My children spoke softly, reasonably, their tone full of that overtrained compassion you hear from people who have already decided what's best for you. "Mom," Peter said finally, looking up at last, "we can't keep checking on you. It's not sustainable." The word sustainable. He ran an accounting firm. I suppose he thought life was just another spreadsheet. I wanted to tell him I'd changed his diapers on a night when his fever hit 104, and the doctor said it might not break. I wanted to ask Elaine if she remembered the time I drove 3 hours in a snowstorm because her car broke down outside Albany. But I didn't say any of that. They wouldn't have heard it. They were speaking a language I no longer belonged to, the dialect of efficiency, of managed concern. When Elaine stood and placed her hand on my shoulder, I felt a flash of cold fury that startled even me. "You'll love it there, Mom," she said. "They have a view of the lake." A view of the lake, as if scenery could substitute for freedom. I heard myself say, quietly, "I see. So it's the nursing home or the street." She hesitated, then nodded, relieved that I'd finally named the choices she'd so carefully avoided. "We don't want it to sound harsh," she murmured, and I almost laughed. "But you need to decide." It was nearly dusk. The light in the room had turned the color of weak tea, that tired amber that makes everything look older than it is. I looked around at the walls I'd painted myself, at the oak table that had belonged to my mother, at the dent in the floor where Peter dropped his toy truck when he was 3. I thought of all the ordinary moments those walls had seen, all the birthdays, burnt casseroles, and quiet mornings with coffee. Then I looked back at them, their polished faces, their careful distance, and realized something simple and terrible. I didn't live there anymore, even if my body still stood in the doorway. I packed that night. Not the way a person packs for travel, but the way a person packs for survival. A few clothes, my passport, a photograph of my late husband, and a small tin box where I kept the cash I'd been saving for emergencies. I suppose this qualified. The air in the house was heavy, as if it too knew something final was happening. On the kitchen counter, Elaine had left a list: contacts for the nursing home, details about billing, medication schedules, as if I were already a patient. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into the trash. I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow, the way you feel after a storm passes and you realize the roof is gone, but the walls are still standing. I sat for a long while in the dark living room, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I wondered if they'd call in the morning to check on me, if they'd notice the car was gone, if they'd feel relief or guilt. Then I wondered why I still cared what they felt. When I finally walked out the front door, the night air felt strange, almost too alive, as if the world had been waiting for me to step back into it. I carried one small suitcase and the keys to a life that no longer wanted me. My car, an old sedan that coughed when it started, sat at the curb under a broken streetlight. I got in, turned the key, and waited for the engine to catch. It did, reluctantly, like an old friend waking from a deep sleep. I didn't have a plan. I didn't even know where I was going. I just knew I wasn't driving toward any place where people would call me resident. That first night, I parked behind the old library near the edge of town. It was closed now, the windows boarded, the sign half fallen. I sat there in the dark and listened to the soft hiss of rain on the windshield. I should have been terrified, I suppose. A woman my age, alone, nowhere to go. But what I felt was something I hadn't felt in years. A quiet, raw awareness that everything I did next would be entirely my own. No one would tell me when to take my pills or whether it was safe to walk to the corner store. I could fail completely, and it would still be mine. That realization came with a strange kind of peace. I thought of my husband, George, gone almost 20 years now, his laugh still echoing in the corners of memory. He used to say, "You're tougher than you think, Claire." I'd roll my eyes then, but sitting in that car, I whispered, "I hope you were right." Outside, the rain thickened, drumming on the roof in slow rhythm. I leaned back, pulled the old coat tighter around my shoulders, and tried to imagine what tomorrow would look like. Maybe I'd drive to the next town. Maybe I'd find a diner that didn't mind a woman nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. Maybe I'd find someone who needed help cleaning or sorting books. I used to volunteer at the library, shelving returned novels, breathing in the dust and ink like perfume. I remembered how good it felt to be useful without being used. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to the gray wash of morning and the sound of birds arguing in a tree above. The world looked both ordinary and unfamiliar. I walked to a gas station bathroom, washed my face in cold water, and studied my reflection. My hair was silver, yes, but my eyes were steady. There was a smear of determination in them that startled me. I realized that while my children had given me 2 options, I had quietly invented a third, the one where I didn't disappear. By noon, I was driving again, following roads I didn't know by name, guided only by instinct. I passed a row of shuttered stores, then a small park where an old man fed pigeons from a paper bag. I parked and watched him for a while. There was something sacred in the simplicity of that act, like a ceremony for those of us who'd been left behind. When he noticed me, he lifted his hand in greeting. I waved back. It was the first time in weeks someone had looked at me without suspicion or pity. That tiny gesture felt enormous, like the start of something. By the second day, exhaustion crept in. I spent the night in a cheap motel off Route 9, the kind with a flickering neon sign and carpet that smelled faintly of damp years. The room was small, but it was mine. I brewed weak coffee in the plastic machine and drank it sitting on the bed, watching sunlight crawl across the floor. I thought again of my house, the gleaming kitchen, the smooth silence my children had curated so carefully. It wasn't home anymore. This shabby little room, with its rattling heater and thin curtains, felt more honest. I realized I hadn't cried once since leaving. The tears didn't come, not because I was strong, but because something inside me refused to give them that victory. I don't know when the thought first came. The idea that I could build something from all this. It wasn't a thunderclap, more like a whisper under the noise of traffic and fatigue. I passed through a small town and saw a boarded-up storefront with a faded sign above it. Bell's Books, Est 1928. The windows were clouded with dust, but behind the grime I could just make out shelves, empty and waiting. My heart gave a strange, small leap. I parked and pressed my palm against the glass. It felt cold, but real. For a moment I saw myself inside, stacking books, sweeping the floor, making coffee for anyone who wandered in. It was ridiculous, impossible, and yet something inside me stirred, something that had been buried under years of politeness and compromise. I whispered aloud, maybe not yet, but soon. When the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat in the car watching the light fade from the old building's windows. The air smelled faintly of rain again. I thought of Elaine's voice, her tone of professional kindness saying, "We just want you to be safe." Safe, I realized, is another word for silent. That night, as I turned the key in the ignition and the engine grumbled to life, I smiled for the first time in a long while. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, the choice was mine. The day that sealed everything began without warning, the way disasters often do, with something painfully ordinary. I was parked behind the library again, sipping coffee from a paper cup gone lukewarm, when my phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I hadn't planned to answer it. I hadn't planned to answer anyone, but I saw Elaine's name flash across the screen, and habit, that old obedient instinct, made me pick up. Her voice came filtered through that brittle politeness she uses when she wants something. "Mom," she said, "we've been talking, and we really think it's time you stop this nonsense. You can't live in your car. You're not 20. Be reasonable." The word reasonable again, always their shield, their way of dressing control and virtue. I didn't reply right away, just listened to the sound of her breathing, quick and annoyed. "We've called Silver Pines," she continued. "They have a room ready. If you come back today, we can help you move in. Otherwise, well, you're on your own. We can't keep doing this." It was the same line as before, but now sharpened, final. I realized they'd already decided I was gone, already built a new life around my absence. I looked out the window at the drizzle streaking the glass and said quietly, "I understand." It startled her. "You do?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Perfectly." Then I hung up. That click, that small act of ending, felt louder than any argument I'd ever had with her. An hour later, I drove to the edge of town without really meaning to, just letting the car roll through streets I hadn't seen in decades. There was a bus stop near the old mill, and sitting there was a woman bundled in 3 coats, her hair white and wild as milkweed. She was talking to herself, or maybe to the pigeons. I don't know what made me stop, but I did. "You okay there?" I asked through the open window. She turned and smiled with 3 teeth missing and said, "Better than most." Her name was Ruth, she told me later, and she'd been living rough for 6 years since her husband died. "They said I'd never manage," she said, her eyes bright under the grime. "Turns out I'm harder to lose than they thought." We sat together for a while, just 2 old women who'd slipped out of the cages others built for them. She showed me where the soup kitchen served lunch and where it was safe to park overnight without the police knocking on your window. There was no pity between us, only a quiet, pragmatic understanding. When she stood to leave, she said, "Don't let them make you small, honey. The world does that enough already." I watched her walk away into the gray afternoon and felt something shift inside me, a mixture of grief and strange pride. I wasn't the only one who'd refused to disappear. That night, I drove past Silver Pines, just to see it for myself. It sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a low, modern building surrounded by perfect landscaping. Through the wide windows, I could see rows of identical chairs, beige and obedient. A few residents sat watching a television mounted too high on the wall, their faces lit by its cold blue light. No one spoke. It looked peaceful, yes, but it was the peace of sedation, of slow erasure. I imagined myself there, in one of those chairs, my days measured by meal schedules and visiting hours, my memories handled like fragile antiques. I turned the car around without stopping. The gate creaked behind me as it closed, slow and deliberate, and I thought, that's not safety, that's burial. I ended up back in the town center near that same shuttered bookstore I'd seen before. The sign above the door was still half hanging, the glass smeared with decades of dust. But in the faint reflection I could see myself. Tired, yes, but standing. There was a paper notice taped to the inside of the door, yellowed with time. Property managed by Hargrove Realty. Inquiries, 5V5-2179. I copied the number into my notebook without really thinking. It felt absurd. I had no money for rent, let alone a shop. But something about that decaying place pulled at me, like a memory I couldn't name. I went back to the car and sat with the engine off, listening to the rain hammer the roof. I thought of all the years I'd spent keeping things in order. Marriage, children, house, birthdays, the invisible labor of being the axis everyone else spun around. And now, when I'd finally slowed enough to need gentleness, they had declared me unmanageable. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was. The idea didn't scare me anymore. The next morning I called the number. A woman answered, her voice sharp and efficient. Hargrove Realty. I asked about the Bell's Books property, expecting her to laugh at the idea of someone like me renting it. But she said, "It's not officially on the market. Belongs to an old lady, Mrs. Kramer. She's been looking for someone to keep an eye on it, just to make sure no one breaks in. You'd have to speak with her directly." She gave me an address 2 streets away. I hesitated for half a heartbeat, then drove there. The house was small, its porch cluttered with potted plants that looked half alive, half ghost. When I knocked, it took nearly a minute before the door opened. Mrs. Kramer was in her 80s, maybe older, her gray hair pinned into a lopsided bun. "You're here about the shop?" she asked, before I even introduced myself. I nodded. "Can't pay much," I said. "Don't need much," she replied, and stepped aside. The house smelled of lavender and onions. "You can stay upstairs if you keep the place clean. I can't go there anymore. Too many stairs." I agreed before she finished her sentence. I didn't ask about rent. She didn't offer. It felt like a transaction older than money. 2 women exchanging need for trust. When she handed me the keys, I noticed her hand trembled. Mine didn't. Walking into that bookstore for the first time felt like entering a church abandoned, but not forsaken. The air was thick with dust and silence. Shelves lined the walls, most empty, though a few still held forgotten paperbacks curled at the edges like dried leaves. In the corner stood a counter with a cash register that probably hadn't rung in decades. I touched it gently, half expecting it to crumble. The floorboards creaked under my shoes, their protest oddly comforting. Sunlight leaked through the gaps in the boarded windows, slanting across the floor in pale ribbons. I remember whispering, "You're still standing," as if I were speaking to both of us. For the first week, I swept, scrubbed, and aired out the rooms. I slept upstairs on a narrow cot Mrs. Kramer had left, the springs loud enough to startle me each time I turned. I cooked oatmeal on a hot plate and boiled water in an old kettle that whistled like a stubborn child. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. I hadn't realized how hungry I was for ownership, not of things, but of my own time, my own choices. I started to open the windows during the day, letting the town's noise seep back into the space. Traffic, laughter, the clatter of someone's dog tags on the pavement. Slowly, the dust settled into corners like tame ghosts. One afternoon, a teenage girl with a backpack stopped outside and peered in through the window. I waved. She hesitated, then smiled back and said, "Is this place opening again?" I almost said no. Then I heard myself answer, "Maybe." The word hung in the air, a promise I hadn't planned to make. After she left, I stood there for a long time, touching the edge of the counter, thinking about what it would mean to bring this place back to life. It sounded impossible, but so had everything else I'd survived. That night, I made a list in the margin of an old ledger I'd found. Broom, paint, light bulbs, sign. Underneath, I wrote one more word: begin. Then came the call from Peter. It was late, the kind of hour when calls from family mean emergencies or guilt. His voice was cold, controlled. "Mom, we heard from Elaine that you've been squatting somewhere. This has to stop. If you won't come willingly, we'll have to take legal steps. We've spoken with a social worker." My stomach clenched, but my voice stayed calm. "Do what you think you must," I said. "But I've already made my choice." He said something else, something about safety and responsibility, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was looking at the open window, at the way the moonlight touched the empty shelves. When I hung up, I felt no fear, just a strange certainty that this was the moment everything broke open. They could take my name off their emergency contact lists, but not off my story. The next morning, I walked to the post office and bought a padlock for the front door, not because I expected intruders, but because I liked the click of metal closing on my own terms. That sound, the lock sliding shut, decisive and final, was the true beginning. I realized that the betrayal hadn't been the choice they offered me. It was their assumption that I wouldn't survive without their permission. Standing there in that dusty shop with the keys in my pocket and paint dust on my hands, I understood the full measure of what they'd done. They had exiled me from their world, and in doing so, accidentally freed me to build my own. The weeks that followed slipped by in a rhythm I hadn't known my body still remembered. The rhythm of working with my hands, of exhaustion that meant something. Each morning, I woke before dawn to the sound of the church bells echoing faintly through the fog that rolled off the river. I'd make coffee in the chipped kettle, wrap myself in a shawl, and stand at the window of the bookstore's upper room, watching the town come alive. Delivery trucks rumbled over the cobblestones, streetlights blinked out one by one, and a bakery 2 doors down released the smell of bread into the damp air. It was the smell that anchored me, reminded me that life existed beyond fear and exile. After years of moving through days that belonged to everyone but me, I finally had hours that were mine to waste or fill as I pleased. I spent them scrubbing, painting, cataloging the abandoned volumes left behind by whoever had locked this place up and walked away decades earlier. There were whole afternoons when I didn't think of my children at all, and when I realized it, I felt guilty for about 5 minutes before the guilt dissolved into something softer, relief. By the second week, the dust had become an ally. It rose in lazy clouds around me as I worked, catching the sunlight in tiny golden sparks. I spoke to it sometimes, half joking, calling it the ghosts of all the words once read here. I found slips of paper in old books, notes from another time, grocery lists, love messages, reminders scrawled in pencil. Pick up milk. Call Harold. Don't forget taxes. The ordinary lives of strangers folded between the pages felt like whispers saying, "We were here once too." That intimacy, that quiet human residue, made me determined to keep the place alive. I scavenged furniture from curbs and thrift stores, mismatched tables and chairs, a rug with frayed edges that smelled faintly of cedar. The transformation was slow, uneven, but each object placed inside made the space less hollow. I hung a small sign on the door one afternoon that said, "Closed for now," written in my looping hand. The "for now" was important. It was a promise, not to customers, but to myself. Mrs. Kramer would visit once a week to bring groceries or check on me, though she never stayed long. She was a woman who valued solitude almost as much as I did. One morning, she stood at the door holding a bag of apples. "You've got spirit," she said, squinting at the fresh paint on the window frames. "Spirit can keep you alive longer than vitamins." She said it like a blessing and left before I could answer. That night, I sliced one of the apples and thought of how easily people mistake frailty for fragility. My hands shook a little as I worked, not from weakness, but from sheer determination. I had spent years being careful, polite, deferential. Now I wanted to see what happened if I stopped apologizing for existing. The town began to notice me. A mailman started delivering envelopes to the door instead of leaving them in Mrs. Kramer's box, just so he could peek in and ask what I was planning. A woman from the bakery offered me day-old pastries. The teenage girl from before returned, this time with 2 friends, and asked again if the store would ever open. "Maybe," I said with a smile, "but not yet. Things take time when you're doing them right." She nodded solemnly, as if I'd said something important. Their curiosity became my silent encouragement. It was proof that I wasn't invisible. For so long, invisibility had been my punishment for aging, for slowing down, for no longer being useful in the ways the world measures use. Here, covered in paint and sweat, I felt visible again, even radiant in my anonymity. But as the bookstore grew more alive, the outside world began to creep back in, testing the edges of my fragile peace. Letters started arriving. Official envelopes stamped with county seals and insurance logos. I ignored them at first, assuming they were remnants of Mrs. Kramer's old paperwork. But one morning, I opened one and found my own name staring back at me in black ink. Notice of concern. Adult Protective Services. It stated that a report had been filed regarding my potential endangerment and unsuitable living conditions. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and unmistakable. My children had done this. There was no other explanation. My throat tightened, not in fear, but in a deep, weary disappointment. They hadn't called, hadn't written anything human, just sent the system after me like a net. For a moment, I imagined them around a dinner table, speaking of me in the past tense. We tried. We did our best. She made her choice. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a drawer, and sat very still. Then I began to laugh. Not a loud laugh, but a slow, shaking one that came from somewhere near the bone. If they wanted to call me incapable, they would have to see how capable I could be. That afternoon, I walked to the library, which had reopened in a smaller building on Main Street. I asked for a computer terminal and spent an hour teaching myself how to navigate online forms. The clerk, a young man with a kind expression, hovered nearby. "Need help, ma'am?" he asked. "No," I said. "I'm learning." By sunset, I had registered a business name, The Second Key Books. The choice came without thought. I'd kept the old brass key to my family home on my keyring all this time, long after they changed the locks. It was useless now, except as a reminder that every door can open twice. Once to let you in, and once to let you out. The process of claiming that name, of typing it with my own hands, filled me with a quiet thrill I hadn't felt since I was young. When I left the library, the air was cool, and the streetlights were just flickering on. The world looked cleaner somehow, sharper at the edges, as if it too had been waiting for me to wake up. Still, the letter from Adult Services lingered in my mind like a bruise. I began to worry that someone would show up to inspect the place, to judge the way I lived by standards built for people who'd stopped trying. For a few days I slept poorly, waking at every sound, listening for a knock that didn't come. But no one arrived. Perhaps they'd seen my registration online and realized I wasn't an abandoned cause. Or perhaps the file sat on some bureaucrat's desk, half read and forgotten. Either way, the silence felt like a small victory. I took the letter, tore it neatly into strips, and used it to kindle the first fire I'd lit in the shop's old stove. The paper curled and blackened quickly, and the flames warmed the room with a faint, smoky sweetness. Watching it burn, I whispered to the ghosts of my old life. You tried to bury me under paperwork. I turned it into heat. As autumn deepened, the town's trees flamed gold and red outside the window, and the smell of wood smoke crept into every street. I began leaving the door unlocked during the day so people could wander in. A retired teacher started bringing boxes of books she no longer wanted. A mechanic down the block helped me fix the light above the doorway. Slowly, the second key became less an idea and more a breathing place. I'd spend evenings sitting at the counter with a mug of tea, reading by lamplight, while the wind rattled the window panes. Sometimes, I'd catch my reflection in the glass and barely recognize the woman staring back. Not because she looked younger, but because she looked present. The lines on my face hadn't vanished. They'd settled into something honest, like topography carved by time rather than decay. Then came the night I saw Elaine again, though she didn't see me. I was walking back from the grocery store, the first real storm of the season beginning to fall, when a car slowed beside the curb. A sleek black sedan, too new for this old part of town. The window lowered, and for a heartbeat, I saw her profile. Perfect hair, that same furrowed brow she used to give me when I forgot to text her back. She was talking on her phone, her expression tight. She looked right past me, not out of malice, but because in her mind I was still missing. She drove off before recognition had a chance to spark. I stood in the rain, clutching my paper bag, and realized I didn't want to call out. Let her believe I'd vanished. Let her build her story of the lost mother, the burden she couldn't save. The truth was quieter, harder, and infinitely more alive. I walked home, drenched, humming to myself, the sound of my boots on wet pavement steady as a heartbeat. By November, the shelves were half full, the walls freshly painted, and the front window clean enough to reflect the passing world again. The teenagers came back, this time bringing a hand-painted sign they'd made for me. Open soon? In bright blue letters. I laughed and hung it inside. Soon, I promised them, though I wasn't sure what soon meant. There was still the matter of utilities, of licenses, of paperwork I only half understood. But it didn't matter. The place already felt open in spirit. People stopped by just to talk. They told me about their childhoods, their losses, their half-finished dreams. Somehow, this dusty shop had become a confessional for everyone who had nowhere else to be heard. I listened, poured them tea, and in their words I found pieces of my own healing reflected back at me. Yet underneath the quiet triumph ran a current of unease, a sense that the peace I'd built was precarious. One evening, as I was closing up, I noticed a figure standing across the street under the street lamp. It was too dark to see clearly, but the posture, the squared shoulders, the stillness, made my stomach tighten. I waited for the figure to move, but it didn't. Finally, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and went upstairs. When I looked again from the window, the street was empty. It might have been nothing, or it might have been someone sent to check, to confirm that the stubborn old woman hadn't yet surrendered. I lay awake for hours, listening to the creak of the floorboards, the steady breath of the building around me. Fear came in small doses, but it never stayed long. What replaced it was resolve, the kind you only find when you realize no one is coming to rescue you, and that's all right. The first escalation, I suppose, wasn't a single event, but a dawning clarity that freedom is not given, it's seized, sometimes quietly, sometimes with paint-stained hands and an unyielding heart. The betrayal of being left behind had morphed into something else entirely, a hunger to define my own worth before the world decided it for me again. I was no longer waiting for a knock, an apology, or permission. Each morning, I swept the front step, brewed my coffee, and whispered the same simple truth to the dust motes dancing in the sunlight. You can begin again, even here, even now, even at 81. And the silence that followed didn't argue. It felt like agreement. The morning the shift truly began was quiet, almost tender in its ordinariness. I woke before dawn, the air inside the little room thick with the chill that comes just before sunrise. I sat on the edge of the cot for a long while, my knees wrapped in the old shawl that used to hang on the back of George's favorite chair. The window was fogged, but through it I could see the faint blur of the world coming alive, light bleeding slowly into the sky, the silhouettes of birds tracing uncertain paths between telephone wires. I'd lived in the upper room above the bookshop for nearly 3 months by then. Time had become an elastic thing, stretching wide and soft. It was no longer divided into appointments or phone calls or the steady tick of family obligation. It was mine to fill, and that freedom, though fragile, was beginning to feel like home. But something was stirring beneath the surface of that peace, a sense that the stillness had ripened into readiness. I didn't know it yet, but that day would be the beginning of my return to the living, the moment when I stopped simply surviving outside of their world and started building my own inside it. Downstairs, the floorboards were cold under my feet as I made my way through the half-lit shop. The air smelled faintly of paper and pine, a scent that had become a kind of comfort, the way certain songs are comforting, not because they're cheerful, but because they've seen you through every shade of grief. I brewed coffee, sat by the front window, and watched the street. There was a delivery truck parked across the road, its driver eating a sandwich with one hand while reading something on his phone. A woman passed by walking her dog, her breath visible in the cold air. She waved. That wave, small, unassuming, was enough to make me feel tethered again. It's astonishing how little it takes to remind a person that they exist. When I finally unlocked the front door, the bell above it gave its usual half-hearted jingle. It wasn't a grand reopening. I simply propped the door open and wrote, "Come in, if you'd like," on a scrap of cardboard. Within an hour, 2 curious women wandered inside, the kind who move through small towns with permanent familiarity. One of them wore a knitted hat that sagged like a soft fruit. The other had a voice that carried as if she'd been practicing projection her entire life. "Well, this is a surprise," the louder one said, running her hand over the freshly painted counter. "We thought this place was closed for good." I told her maybe it wasn't. That was all it took. She smiled, bought a battered copy of Anne of Green Gables, and left, promising to return with friends. It was such a simple transaction, but as I placed the first dollar bill in the old cash register, I felt a shiver of something close to joy. The sound the drawer made when it closed was clean, final, like punctuation at the end of a long, unfinished sentence. Over the next few weeks, people began to drift in. Curious locals, wandering students, retirees with too much time and too few places to belong. They didn't just buy books. They lingered. They talked. They told me stories I didn't ask for but listened to, as if each one were a secret worth keeping. There was a man who came every Thursday to sit by the window and read the newspaper without ever buying anything. A young mother who left her toddler to play on the rug while she thumbed through self-help books. A woman named Lena who started dropping off small vases of wildflowers for the counter every Monday, claiming the place looked lonely without color. I didn't tell her that I'd been lonely too, or that her flowers made the room smell like spring even in the brittle heart of winter. I just thanked her and set the vase beside the register, where it caught the morning light. I began to change in ways too subtle to notice at first. My body grew stronger from the constant movement, lifting boxes, climbing ladders, sweeping floors until the broom bristles thinned. My voice, unused for so long, found a rhythm again in conversation. I started sleeping more deeply, the kind of sleep that comes not from exhaustion, but from contentment. And yet, there was still a small, hard knot of disbelief inside me. Every night I'd lock up and climb the stairs, certain that when morning came, someone would appear to tell me it was over, that the bookstore had been a misunderstanding, a borrowed dream. But each dawn, the world stayed real. The light still fell through the windows in long, patient ribbons. The books still waited quietly, their spines lined up like the ribs of a living creature. One afternoon, while I was restocking a shelf near the back, the bell over the door rang. I expected another customer, but when I turned, I saw a woman standing there with a clipboard. She introduced herself as Maureen from the Department of Community Services. My first thought was that the letter had finally caught up with me. She smiled, professional, but not unkind, and explained she was following up on a report concerning my well-being. The phrase made my stomach tighten. "We received word you might be living in unsafe conditions," she said, scanning the room. I took a slow breath and gestured around. "Does this look unsafe to you?" She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then admitted it didn't. We sat at the counter while she filled out her forms, her pen scratching quickly. She asked the usual questions about my income, medical needs, family. I answered each one carefully, refusing to sound defensive. When she finished, she looked at me for a long moment and said quietly, "You seem more stable than most people I visit." I almost laughed. That's because I stopped waiting for other people to decide if I was. She smiled then, the kind of smile that belonged to someone who understood more than her job allowed her to say. Before leaving, she slipped one of the store's bookmarks into her folder and promised to come back as a customer. That evening, after she'd gone, I sat at the window with a cup of tea and watched the light fade. I thought about the thin line between independence and invisibility, how easily society confuses the two. If I'd chosen the nursing home, they would have called it responsibility. Choosing the street, they called it danger. But this life, this narrow balance of solitude and purpose, felt more honest than anything that had come before. For the first time, I wasn't living inside someone else's version of what was good for me. The realization filled me with an almost reckless sense of agency, a current of quiet defiance that hummed beneath everything I did. Around that time, I met someone who would become part of the fabric of my days. His name was Arthur. He was in his late 70s, tall and slightly stooped, with hands that looked permanently ink-stained, even though he wasn't a writer. He came in one rainy afternoon, shaking water from his hat, and asked if I carried used history books. I showed him the small section I'd set up near the back, and he stood there reading for nearly an hour. When he finally approached the counter, he placed a worn volume of Churchill's memoirs in front of me. "This place smells like my childhood," he said. "In a good way, not the mothball way." I laughed, and that was the beginning. He started coming every few days after that, sometimes buying, sometimes just sitting by the window with tea. We talked about small things at first: weather, the news, the stubborn resilience of pigeons. But slowly, our conversations grew deeper, winding their way into the kind of quiet companionship that asks for nothing but presence. He never pried about my family or my past, and that omission was a kind of mercy. The store became our shared refuge, a place where time loosened its grip. On slow afternoons, I'd find him repairing a wobbly chair or reading aloud from a book of poems. His voice was gravelly, softened by kindness. One day he said, "People think survival is about endurance. It's not. It's about reinvention." I wrote that sentence on a piece of paper and taped it to the inside of the counter. It became my quiet mantra. Winter came hard that year, the river freezing at its edges, the snow piling against the shop's front door. But inside, the air stayed warm with the smell of books and the low hum of the heater. Customers brought thermoses of coffee, left scarves on the coat rack, lingered just for the company. There were days when I caught myself humming while dusting shelves, an unconscious melody from decades ago. That's how I knew the shift was complete. I wasn't waiting for life to change anymore. I was inside the change, breathing it, shaping it. Then, on a morning in late January, a letter arrived. The envelope was pale blue, the handwriting unfamiliar but careful. It was from my grandson. Kieran. The words inside were simple. Grandma, I don't know where you are, but I hope you're safe. Dad says you're confused. I don't think that's true. I miss you. Please write if you can. His note trembled slightly, not with pity, but with love. I held it for a long time, tracing the ink with my thumb. The past I had walked away from was still reaching for me, but not in anger, not in control, just a quiet longing from one soul to another. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I placed the letter in the drawer beside the register, next to the first dollar I'd earned from the shop. 2 beginnings, side by side. That night, as snow whispered against the windows, I sat at the counter and whispered back to the silence. Maybe it's time. The shift had already happened. The world just hadn't caught up yet. The woman who'd once been told to choose between the nursing home and the street was now something else entirely. She had built a place with her name on the lease, her fingerprints on the door, and her laughter echoing between the shelves. She had chosen not to vanish, and in doing so, she had stumbled into the truest kind of freedom, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, only to exist. It began with the letter that wasn't blue. It was white, thick, official, the kind that seems heavier than paper should be. The return address said Lansing and Pierce, attorneys at law. And for a long time I just looked at it, tracing the embossed logo with my fingertip as if it might tell me what waited inside. I knew even before I opened it that peace had a short half-life, that the world I'd built from dust and quiet resolve would eventually draw the attention of those who still believed they had the right to decide my fate. When I finally tore the envelope, the first sentence confirmed it. This correspondence serves to inform you that your immediate family has initiated proceedings to establish legal guardianship on your behalf, citing concerns regarding competency, safety, and financial management. The words spread across the page like frost, each one precise and merciless. I read them twice, the way one might reread a diagnosis, hoping that the meaning might shift if I stared long enough. It didn't. It said exactly what I feared. It said that my own children had decided to make me their ward, their dependent, their project. They hadn't even called first. The days that followed moved slowly, as if the air itself were thick with some invisible resistance. I tried to continue as usual, sweeping the floor, opening the shop, greeting customers, but the letter lay in my mind like a lead weight. I told no one, not even Arthur. He came by that week with his usual paper bag of oranges, humming a tune I half recognized, and I smiled and poured him tea. But my hands trembled slightly as I set the cup down, and he noticed. "You all right?" he asked. I wanted to say yes, but the lie caught in my throat. So instead I said, "Just tired." He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes clear and knowing, and then said softly, "Tired doesn't suit you. You're the least tired person I know." I almost laughed. If only he'd known what kind of fatigue had set in, the kind that comes not from the body, but from being forced to prove your own existence again and again. A week later, another envelope arrived, this one a court notice. Hearing scheduled in the matter of guardianship of Claire M. Halberg. My name, there in bold type, felt like an accusation. The date was 3 weeks away. I sat at the counter and stared at it until the light outside dimmed and the words blurred. What they were trying to do was perfectly legal. All it required was a doctor's statement and a judge willing to believe that an elderly woman living alone could not possibly be making rational decisions. I could already imagine Elaine's practiced calm in the courtroom, her careful explanations about concern for Mother's safety, her lists of episodes, the time I forgot a grocery bag at the store, the time I fell asleep with a candle burning. She would speak gently, her tone wrapped in maternal reason, while Peter would nod gravely beside her, playing the part of the responsible son. They would not mention that they'd left me with nothing but two impossible choices, that their compassion had always been conditional. To the court, they would look like saints. To me, they looked like strangers who shared my blood. I didn't tell Mrs. Kramer either. She was fragile now, her health declining rapidly, and I didn't want to burden her. Instead, I spent those days cleaning, rearranging, polishing the shelves as if order could keep chaos at bay. The shop had become my body's extension. Each surface, each book, each tiny adjustment, a declaration that I was still here. The regulars came and went, oblivious to the storm forming just beyond the walls. I smiled, recommended novels, wrapped books in brown paper, and took their coins with steady hands. But when the door closed behind the last customer each night, I would stand in the middle of the floor and feel the silence close in like a question. What if they won? What if a piece of paper signed by a stranger could undo everything I'd rebuilt? I imagined waking in a sterile room, my books gone, my name erased from deeds and ledgers, my voice classified as unreliable. I thought of the windowless halls of those homes, the antiseptic smell, the endless hum of television sets tuned to programs no one watched. The thought made me sick with rage. It was Arthur who, unknowingly, gave me the courage to fight. One afternoon he arrived with a stack of worn maps under his arm and announced that he'd been reorganizing his life. "When you're old," he said, "people expect you to shrink. But maybe the trick is to expand." He spread the maps out on the counter, tracing routes of journeys he still wanted to take. The coast of Maine, the small towns along the Mississippi, the mountains out west. His hands shook slightly as he pointed, but his eyes were alight. "We still have time," he said. I nodded, but something else flickered through me, an understanding that time only mattered if you were allowed to own it. I waited until he left before opening the court letter again. Then I went upstairs, retrieved the tin box where I kept the few savings I'd managed to collect from the shop, and set aside enough to hire a lawyer. If they wanted a fight, I would give them one. The lawyer I found was young. Too young, I thought at first. But she listened. Her name was Dana Alvarez, and she had a way of looking at people that made you feel seen to the bone. I told her everything, from the ultimatum in the living room to the nights in my car to the bookstore's rebirth. When I finished, she sat back, tapping her pen against the desk. "They won't expect you to contest it," she said. "That's their mistake." She explained that guardianship cases often favored the petitioner. Courts liked tidy narratives of protection. "But," she added, "what you have is evidence of autonomy. Business registration, community engagement, witnesses. They've painted a story of decline. We'll show them one of renewal." Her confidence startled me. For years I'd been treated like a delicate object, something to be managed, stored, preserved. Now here was someone speaking to me like I was still a force of motion. "Can you win?" I asked. She smiled. "You can. I'll just help you tell the truth." The weeks leading to the hearing passed in a blur of paperwork and sleepless nights. Dana visited the shop often, gathering signatures from the townspeople who'd come to know me. Lena with her flowers, the mailman who stopped for tea, even the librarian who'd helped me register the business. Each one signed without hesitation. I hadn't realized how visible I'd become until I saw their names written beside mine. "You've built a whole neighborhood around yourself," Dana said one evening as she tucked the forms into her bag. "That's what they can't understand. They think independence means isolation, but you've created connection on your own terms." Her words warmed me, but they also frightened me. Connection was fragile. It could be broken by a single judge's ruling, dissolved into the thin air of legality. The night before the hearing, Arthur came by after closing. He brought a small thermos of soup and a look of quiet concern. "I know something's been wrong," he said. I hesitated, then told him everything. He listened without interruption, his face unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "They want to protect their version of you," he said. "The one that fits their comfort. But you're not her anymore." He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. "Don't let them turn your life into a memorial while you're still breathing." We sat there a long time, the clock ticking softly behind us. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of losing. I was afraid of not fighting hard enough. The courthouse smelled of paper and disinfectant, a scent that always makes me think of waiting rooms and endings. Dana guided me through the security line, her hand steady on my elbow. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I saw Elaine and Peter for the first time in nearly a year. Elaine looked thinner, her hair pulled tight, her mouth a controlled line. Peter avoided my eyes, just as he had that day in the living room. Elaine greeted me with a smile too polished to be real. "Mom," she said, "we didn't want it to come to this." I answered evenly, "Then you shouldn't have made it come to this." She blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in my voice. We sat on opposite benches while the clerk called the case. Inside, the proceedings were as clinical as I'd feared. Elaine spoke first, her tone calm, rehearsed. She described my episodes of confusion, my refusal of support, the unsafe conditions in which I supposedly lived. Each phrase was a knife dulled by politeness. Peter added his part, something about my isolation and erratic financial decisions. The judge nodded, taking notes. When my turn came, Dana stood and called witnesses. One by one, the people from my new life came forward. The librarian, the baker, even Arthur. They spoke not about my competence, but about my contribution. The librarian described how I'd revived the bookshop and turned it into a haven. Lena told the court about the weekly gatherings, the reading sessions, the warmth of the space. Arthur, his voice steady, said simply, "She saved herself when no one else cared to try. If that's incompetence, then we should all be so lucky." His words hung in the air like a benediction. When it was my turn, I stood slowly, every eye on me. "My children believe they're protecting me," I said. "But they're protecting an idea that doesn't exist anymore. I am not helpless. I am not confused. I remember every detail of the life they think I've forgotten. I remember the house I built, the nights I stayed awake when they were sick, the mornings I drove them to school in the rain. And I remember the moment they told me I had two choices, the nursing home or the street. What they didn't realize was that there was a third option, freedom. I took it, and I built something out of it. I built a place that matters. My voice shook only once on the word freedom. Then I sat down. The judge was silent for a long moment. Papers rustled. The clock on the wall ticked audibly, marking each second like a heartbeat. Finally, he looked up. "The court finds insufficient evidence to establish guardianship," he said. "The petition is dismissed." The gavel fell with a sound like the closing of a door that would never reopen. Elaine's mouth opened slightly, as if she couldn't process defeat. Peter stared at the floor. I felt no triumph, only an immense, quiet relief that washed through me like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. Afterward, outside the courthouse, Elaine approached me. "Mom," she began, her voice brittle. "We were just trying to help." I met her eyes. "Then next time," I said, "try listening." She said nothing more. Peter offered a handshake he didn't mean. I turned away, walked down the courthouse steps, and stepped into the sunlight. It felt warmer than it should have, as if the world itself approved. Back at the shop that evening, I unlocked the door, inhaled the familiar scent of paper and dust, and felt the walls breathe with me. Arthur was there, waiting, leaning against the counter, 2 cups of tea already poured. "Well?" he asked. I smiled. "They lost." He raised his cup. "No," he said. "You won." We sat together in the growing dusk, the shop glowing gold around us, and for the first time in my long life, victory didn't taste like conquest. It tasted like peace. But peace, I've learned, is never static. It keeps asking you to rise to meet it. The next morning, as I swept the front step, a stranger paused to look through the window. "Is this the second key?" she asked. I nodded. "Someone told me you help people start over." I hesitated, then smiled. "Sometimes," I said. "Come in." As she crossed the threshold, I felt the circle complete itself, not as a closing, but as an opening. The second escalation had tested the strength of what I'd built, and what remained after the test was something unbreakable. I wasn't just living anymore. I was leading a quiet rebellion, one book, one breath, one morning at a time. It happened on a Thursday, which felt right somehow, because Thursdays had always been the quietest days at the shop, the in-between space of the week where nothing demanded too much and everything seemed to wait in a kind of gentle suspension. I had been restocking a shelf of poetry anthologies, the smell of old paper thick in the air, when the sound of the bell over the door broke the stillness. I turned, expecting to see one of the regulars, maybe Lena with her flowers, or Arthur with his bag of oranges. But instead, there stood Elaine. She was dressed impeccably, as always, her hair swept back, her expression rehearsed into something that was supposed to resemble composure. Behind her came Peter, holding a leather folder against his chest like a shield. I didn't move, not immediately. It had been months since the court ruling, months since I'd last seen either of them, and I had thought, perhaps naively, that silence had finally become our truce. "Mom," Elaine said, her voice low but already trembling under its own weight. "We need to talk." She didn't wait for permission. She stepped inside, the bell jingling again in protest, and took in the shop with a look that was part confusion, part irritation. "So this is it," she murmured. "This is what you chose." Her eyes swept over the mismatched furniture, the second-hand rugs, the stacks of books that leaned like small monuments to disarray. To her, it must have looked like a ruin, a life shrunken into clutter. To me, it was sacred ground. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I said, forcing calm into my voice. She blinked, unprepared for my tone. "Mom, we're not here to fight." I smiled faintly. "Good. I've already done that once and won." Peter shifted uncomfortably beside her. He looked older, the edges of his confidence dulled. "We didn't come for that," he said. "We came because, well, things have changed. Elaine thought—" He hesitated. "We thought you might want to come back, just for a while. We could make the arrangements. A nurse, maybe, or an apartment closer to us. Somewhere safe. The word hung between us again like a bad smell. Safe. How many times had they wrapped control inside that word, like poison inside candy? I am safe, I said evenly. I've been safe for a long time now. Elaine shook her head, stepping closer, her heels clicking against the worn wooden floor. You can't keep doing this, Mom. Living here, working like this, it's not sustainable. There it was again. Her favorite word. I felt something inside me, some long frayed cord, finally snap. I set the book I'd been holding onto the counter and turned to face her fully. Do you remember the day you gave me that choice? I asked. She frowned, unsure where I was going. The day you said nursing home or the street? Her mouth opened, then closed. That's not fair, she said softly. We were worried about you. Fair? I repeated. You think life is fair when a woman who raised 2 children is told she's an inconvenience? When her voice becomes background noise in her own home? When the people she gave everything to decide she's no longer competent enough to decide whether she wants to keep breathing on her own terms? My voice was calm, but it was the calm of a knife. Peter murmured, Mom, please. But I didn't stop. You called it worry. I call it erasure. You wanted to bury me alive in kindness. Elaine's face hardened, and I saw in her eyes the familiar flicker of frustration, that old belief that she knew better, that she had always known better. We were trying to help, she said again. You don't understand how frightening it was to see you losing control. I took a step closer until I could see the small pulse beating at her temple. No, Elaine. What frightened you was seeing me without your control. There's a difference. For a long moment, we just stood there, the air between us humming with all the words we had never said. Then I turned away, reached under the counter, and pulled out a folder. I had prepared it months ago, though I hadn't known exactly why. Inside were the shop's ownership documents, tax forms, bank records, and the newly printed deed transferring partial ownership from Mrs. Kramer's estate to me. Mrs. Kramer had passed quietly 2 months earlier, leaving her half of the property to me in her will. I had filed the paperwork, paid the fees, and made the bookstore entirely mine. I placed the deed on the counter and tapped it with my finger. Do you see this? I said. This is my life, my business, my name. Every inch of this place exists because I refused to disappear when you told me to. I own it. Legally, irrevocably, proudly. No court, no doctor, no frightened child can take that from me now. Peter's eyes widened slightly, the reality sinking in. Elaine stared at the paper as if it were a foreign object. Mom, she whispered, why are you doing this? Why are you shutting us out? I almost laughed. I'm not shutting you out. You locked the door yourself years ago. I just found another house. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was full of all the ghosts that had followed us here. Every memory, every argument, every apology that never arrived. Finally, Elaine exhaled, her composure cracking just slightly. You can't expect me to just accept this, she said. You're my mother. I nodded slowly. And you're my daughter. But I'm not yours to manage. That's the difference between love and ownership, Elaine. You wanted a mother you could care for like a child, someone who needed you to feel useful. But I don't need you that way anymore. I love you, and I'm fine. She looked as though she might cry, but she didn't. Instead, she reached out and touched the edge of the counter, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood. It's smaller than I imagined, she murmured, as if speaking to herself. But it's alive. For a moment, something soft flickered in her eyes. Recognition, maybe even respect. But it passed quickly, replaced by weariness. She looked at Peter, who only shrugged, defeated. "Come on," she said to him quietly. They turned toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, glancing back at me. "You know," she said, "you always told me to stand up for myself. I suppose you're finally taking your own advice." Then she left. The door closed behind them, and the bell gave one last thin ring before the silence folded back into itself. I stood there for a long time, my hand still resting on the counter. The room around me strangely brighter, as if some veil had lifted. My knees trembled, not from fear, but from the sheer force of having spoken everything I'd carried for years. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. A clean, almost holy exhaustion. I sank onto the stool behind the counter, let out a breath that felt like it had been waiting decades to escape. And for the first time in my life, I believed I had said everything that needed saying. That evening, Arthur arrived as usual. He saw my face, the stillness in the air, and understood without a word. "They came," he said. I nodded. "And they left." He smiled faintly. "Then it's done." I poured us both tea, and we sat in the fading light as the shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Outside, the town moved on in its quiet rhythm, the bakery closing, the street lamps flickering on, the faint sound of laughter from somewhere down the street. Inside, the shop glowed gold and soft. I looked around at everything I had built: the books, the tables, the mismatched chairs, and felt a warmth rise through me that had nothing to do with the tea. Later, when the moon was high and Arthur had gone, I took the deed from the counter and placed it in a wooden box beneath the register. On top of it, I laid the key to my old house, the one I'd carried all this time. I looked at the two pieces of metal, the one that locked me into a life I no longer wanted, and the one that opened the door to this one, and I understood that I didn't need to keep both. So I took the old key, the heavy brass one with the worn edges, and walked outside. The air was cold, the street empty. I crossed to the river at the end of the block, where the water moved slow and dark under the bridge. For a moment, I held the key in my hand, feeling its weight, the ghost of every memory it contained, the smell of Sunday dinners, the sound of children's laughter, the hush of nights when everyone was asleep, and I wandered through rooms that already felt like they belonged to someone else. Then I opened my hand and let it fall. It hit the surface with a small, perfect sound, then vanished. The ripples spread outward, soft and endless. When I returned to the shop, the clock above the door read just past midnight. I locked the door behind me, not to keep anyone out, but to mark the boundary of my own choosing. The second key belonged entirely to me now, not just in deed or law, but in spirit. I sat down by the front window, the one that faced the street, and watched the lights flicker across the glass. The reflection staring back at me was lined, tired, older than I remembered, but her eyes were alive, sharp, certain. I thought of all the years I had spent waiting for permission, to rest, to speak, to stop apologizing, and realized I no longer needed it. The climax of my life, I suppose, wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic or violent. It was a single quiet act, a woman standing in her own shop, her own space, unowned and unafraid. It was the sound of a key sinking into water, and a voice, mine, finally steady, finally free. And as I sat there in the glow of the lamp, surrounded by the breath of old pages and the hum of the world outside, I understood something simple and irrevocable. They had tried to take my life away in the name of love. But love, real love, doesn't confine. It releases. That night, I didn't dream of houses or children or loss. I dreamed of open doors. The days after that night unfolded with a strange, weightless calm, as if the air itself had thinned and everything around me had settled into its rightful place. The world no longer pressed so hard against my chest. The mornings came gently, each one arriving like a small forgiveness. I would wake to the creak of the floorboards above the shop and the first breath of sunlight leaking through the curtains, and for a few moments I would just lie still, listening to the hum of the heater, the distant sound of the town yawning awake. It was an ordinary peace, but it felt like a luxury I had earned with every year of silence, every night of fear, every step that had carried me from the edge of exile to the steady rhythm of belonging. The river outside had frozen at its edges, and sometimes, in the early light, I would see the faint shimmer of that frozen water through the shop's front window. The current still moved beneath it, invisible but constant, and I thought, yes, that's what I've become. Still moving, even under the ice. The bookstore changed too, almost imperceptibly, as though it had been waiting for my own transformation before revealing its final shape. People came not just to buy books anymore, but to talk, to linger, to breathe. It had turned into something halfway between a shop and a refuge. Every Thursday evening, I hosted readings, sometimes of poetry, sometimes of old letters found between book pages. The first time I did it, only 3 people came: Arthur, the librarian, and a young woman who sat in the back and cried quietly into her sleeve. Now, months later, the place filled with faces I knew and some I didn't, all of them drawn to that quiet communion that happens when one voice rises and others listen without expectation. I would stand behind the counter, reading aloud passages from novels, sometimes stories of loss, sometimes joy, sometimes just fragments of language that made the air feel larger. And each time I read, I could feel something repairing itself, not just in me, but in everyone who listened. We were all, in our own ways, survivors of diminishment, finding shape again in words. Arthur still came by most days, though he'd begun walking with a cane. We had developed a ritual. I'd brew tea, he'd tell me about whatever book he'd been reading that week, and we'd sit in companionable silence until closing time. Sometimes he would fall asleep in the chair by the window, the light catching in his white hair, and I'd think how rare it is to find a friendship that requires no performance, no effort beyond presence. When I teased him about it once, he said, "We've both earned our silences, Claire. Let's spend them wisely." It made me smile, because it was true. We had spent so many years being talked over, corrected, dismissed. Silence had been punishment once. Now it was sanctuary. Elaine and Peter called once in a while. The conversations were brief but polite, cautious like a truce after a long war. Elaine had taken to sending postcards instead of letters, photographs of her garden, the grandchildren I hadn't met in years, recipes she thought I might like. I wrote back, always warmly, but with the distance that now felt necessary. We were learning, awkwardly, how to love each other from the right distance. She never apologized directly, and I never asked her to. Some debts are best paid in silence. The last time she visited, she stood in the middle of the shop, looking around as if it were a museum of my stubbornness. "You really made this work," she said, and for the first time, her voice carried no accusation, no disbelief, only a quiet respect. When she left, she hugged me quickly, and though her perfume lingered long after she was gone, it no longer carried the scent of control. It smelled simply like a daughter trying to find her way back to her mother through unfamiliar air. In the evenings, after everyone had gone, I would sit at the window with a glass of wine and watch the town slip into darkness. Sometimes I would see the reflection of my own face in the glass and barely recognize it, not because the lines had vanished, but because they no longer told the story of defeat. They had become maps of endurance, of stubborn grace. There were moments when I still felt the ache of everything that had been taken from me. The years of being unseen, the humiliation of that first ultimatum. But the ache no longer consumed me. It was simply a scar, one that proved I had lived. The river moved beneath the ice. The days passed. I began to write again, small notes at first, then longer reflections, until eventually I filled an entire notebook with thoughts about what it means to be old and alive in a world that prefers its women silent. Sometimes I read from that notebook during Thursday gatherings, and when I did, women I'd never met would come up to me afterward and say things like, "That's exactly what my daughter said to me," or, "I thought I was the only one." Each time, I felt that strange spark of recognition that binds strangers tighter than family. Spring came late that year, slow and deliberate. The ice melted from the river, and one morning I walked down to its edge, watching the water carry away small fragments of winter, branches, bits of ice, pieces of things too light to sink. I thought of the key I'd thrown months before, how it must now be far downstream, resting somewhere in the mud, its purpose fulfilled. I didn't regret letting it go. It had belonged to a life that no longer needed unlocking. When I came back to the shop, Arthur was already there, reading in his chair. He looked up and said, "You've got that look." "What look?" I asked. He smiled. "The one people get when they realize they've survived everything they were supposed to." That evening, I hosted the largest reading yet. The room was full, the air warm with conversation and candlelight. I read a passage from Jane Eyre, my husband's favorite novel, the same book I used to read aloud when the children were small. My voice didn't tremble. It rang steady, deep, almost young. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long time, then filled with soft applause. A young woman approached me afterward, maybe in her 30s, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. "My mother's in a home," she said. "I don't visit much. It feels like she's already gone. But hearing you tonight..." Her voice cracked. "Maybe she isn't." I took her hand and said, "If you still think of her, she isn't gone. And if she remembers who she was, even for a moment, then she's still fighting." She nodded, tears glinting in her eyes, and I realized then that the circle had closed not in isolation, but in legacy. When the crowd left and the lights dimmed, I stayed behind, tidying the tables, feeling the warmth that lingers after people have shared something true. I thought of all the women who might still be sitting in rooms like the one I'd once escaped, women whose lives had been reduced to routines, whose voices had been classified as confusion, whose freedom had been replaced with safety. I wanted to tell them that escape isn't always a leap. Sometimes it's a quiet walk out the door when no one's watching. That freedom doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "You're still here. Keep going." Now, in my 82nd year, I no longer measure life by what I've lost or who I've disappointed. I measure it by mornings like this, when the light falls perfectly across the bookshelves and the dust turns gold in its path. I measure it by the laughter that still rises from the back of the shop, by the people who find their way through my door and leave a little lighter than when they entered. I measure it by the sound of the river, still moving beneath the thawing ice. And sometimes, when I close the shop at night and turn the sign to closed, I whisper to the quiet, "You did it, old woman. You built your own empire out of exile." If anyone ever asks what I learned after all this, after the betrayal, the hunger, the cold, the slow rebuilding, I will tell them this: that no one saves you by taking your choices away, and no kindness built on control will ever be love. I will tell them that dignity has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with agency. And I will tell them, especially the women, the forgotten and the silenced ones, that it is never too late to begin again. Walk, even if your shoes are thin. Speak, even if your voice shakes. Leave, even if no one holds the door for you. The road is waiting, and so is the self you buried beneath obedience. And when you find her, don't apologize for her hunger. Feed it. She will build your empire.